You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, Donald Trump's comments threatening Liz Cheney have obviously surged into the spotlight in these closing days before the 2024 election. But now, because of those comments, two things have grabbed our attention. The first is the prospect of Donald Trump facing criminal charges in Arizona, and the second are the implications for Donald Trump's ongoing prosecutions right now. So I want to start with the second one first. What are the implications based on these comments that he made with the terms of his release in his ongoing prosecutions?
Yeah, Brian, Donald Trump could be in trouble in two separate ways in his criminal cases. Remember, he has multiple criminal cases that are active, cases in which he is a criminal defendant. He is on pretrial release in two cases. He is on pre-sentencing release in his criminal convictions up in New York. And here is how these new threats against Liz Cheney could come into play in those criminal cases, actually in two separate ways. First of all, if he committed a new crime, and we have already heard that the Attorney General in Arizona has opened a criminal probe into these threats to determine whether he in fact committed a new crime. If Donald Trump committed a new crime, then he should, if we apply the rule of law as it was intended to be applied, he should be revoked on pretrial release in the multiple cases in which he's on pretrial release. He should also be revoked on pre-sentence release in New York. Why? Because the conditions of his pretrial and pre-sentence release include that he must not commit any state, federal, or local crime. If this satisfies the elements of threats under Arizona state law, well, then he has inarguably committed a state crime. That means judges should revoke him and should detain him pending trial and pending sentencing. That's one way. Here's the other way. When you are on release in a criminal case, if there is evidence, clear and convincing evidence, that's the standard, that your conduct poses a threat to the community or even one person in the community, then frankly, even if you didn't, technically speaking, commit a new crime, federal, state, or local, you should still be revoked on release and detained, jailed, pending either trial or sentencing. So this could come into play in two different ways, and it could result in Donald Trump being locked up in his criminal cases while those cases proceed through the system. Now, does anybody expect that will happen before the election? I think it unlikely, because we already know that for whatever reason, the law enforcement authorities are not interested in applying the law to Donald Trump the way it would apply to you, me, and every one of our viewers. I can promise them all. But here's what I am hopeful we will see happen, Brian. I am hopeful that as soon as Kamala Harris is declared the victor in the upcoming election, prosecutors and courts will issue what are called show cause orders, directing Donald Trump and his lawyers to show cause why he should not be revoked on release in his cases based on these threats against Liz Cheney.
Moving over to the actual Arizona pending investigation right now, I mean, based on the statute itself, does it seem like there's adequate justification for criminal charges to move forward?
That's a great question. First of all, for anybody scoring at home, the law that is involved is Arizona Code Section 13-1202. 13-1202. First, let's look at the exact words Donald Trump spoke, because I don't want anybody to accuse us of glossing over or misstating what Donald Trump said about Liz Cheney. Here's what he said, quote, "Let's put her," he was talking about Liz Cheney, "let's put her with the rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how safe she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face." First of all, I think the most important word in that sentence is the first word, let's. As we all know from grammar school English, that is a contraction consisting of two words, let us. Let us put a rifle in her hand and train 12 barrels on her face and see how she feels, how safe she feels. Brian, in this old prosecutor's book, that is threatening or intimidating communications or conduct. That is the technical Arizona state law. That is the title of that statute involving threatening or intimidating statements or conduct. So I think there is an argument to be made. Now, we're not going to read through all of the subsections of that Arizona law. I think there's an argument to be made that in the context of what we know about Donald Trump, that was absolutely threatening or intimidating statements or conduct. And here's why I say that. Because you can make all sorts of hyper-technical arguments if you parse through every single word and say, well, he didn't say, I want people to hurt her, but that's what he communicated. And why do we know he communicated that? Because when he communicates things about his enemies, his opponents, political or otherwise, violence ensues. What examples do we have of that? How about the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer? He never expressly said, I want you to hurt her, but he, belittled her, he demeaned her, he mocked her, and he used violence-inducing rhetoric. And we all know some of Donald Trump's little play militiamen then hatched a plot, entered into a conspiracy to kidnap and kill Gretchen Whitmer. Indeed, they were criminally indicted and tried for those crimes. How about the Haitian American community and immigrants? Donald Trump says they're eating cats and dogs, they're stealing your pets, and violence against Haitian Americans and immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, and elsewhere ensues based on language that wasn't even a direct command to hurt those folks. They have been threatened, they have been assaulted, and they have been subjected to endless bomb threats as a result of Donald Trump's statements. How about FEMA workers? Donald Trump lies about the efforts of FEMA workers to bring hurricane relief to folks, for example, down in North Carolina. And what do we have? Donald Trump's little militias are out, quote, hunting FEMA with rifles, with weapons. Then how about hang Mike Pence? Think about it, Brian. We have Donald Trump making statements that Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what he should have done to keep me in power. That was not a direct threat either. What happened? Violence ensued, and his supporters started chanting, hang Mike Pence, and they were hunting for Mike Pence and other elected officials. All of that evidence we just went through, Brian, is relevant to the determination of whether him saying, let us do these things to Liz Cheney, as to whether that is a threat, that is chargeable, that is a violation of Arizona state law. You don't look at those words in isolation or in a vacuum. And let me finish my long-winded answer, admittedly, with this. I was sitting in the courtroom in Washington, D.C., when they were arguing about gag orders in the Trump case. And Donald Trump's lawyer said, hey, Judge, he's not responsible for what his supporters do when he makes those statements. And one of the three judges on that panel said, stop it. We all know Donald Trump makes those statements and threats ensue. So don't tell me there is not a cause and effect relationship. So all of this is a long-winded way of saying I think Donald Trump can and should be charged criminally. And perhaps even more importantly, this should be used as the basis to revoke him on release. Let me add one more thing. When I said he was on pretrial and pre-sentence release, and the conditions of release say that he may not violate any federal, state, or local law, this is an important procedural nicety of revoking somebody on release when they have violated another law. That doesn't have to be proved by the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt, which is what would have to be proved at trial if the Arizona state authorities charge Donald Trump with a crime. It only has to be proved by the relatively low evidentiary standard of a preponderance of the evidence. 51% of the evidence. That is a very low evidentiary hurdle for prosecutors to overcome. Why? Because when you are on pretrial release, you are beholden to a court and you may not violate any law, but we don't have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. If we are going to revoke a defendant, we only have to prove it by a preponderance of the evidence. I know we've turned this into a legal breakdown law school class, but I think these are important concepts for people to keep in mind.
Yeah, no, I think what's also important is that this could either be considered a Class 1 misdemeanor or a Class 3 felony. And the way that it becomes a Class 3 felony from a misdemeanor is if the purpose of the threats or intimidation is to promote or induce someone to participate in gang activity or a racketeering enterprise. And I think that by virtue of Donald Trump including this in his broader scheme to subvert the election results in the exact same way that he's right now being charged for another racketeering enterprise in Georgia and possibly a racketeering enterprise in Arizona, depending on what those indictments look like. And doing the exact same thing here lends credence to the fact that this could also be elevated to a felony in Arizona.
Yeah, no one will ever be able to accuse Donald Trump of learning from his mistakes or learning any lessons from what has already happened to him as a result of his incessant violence-inducing statements, conduct, and posts.
And finally, Glenn, let's finish off with this. I know that some people are going to say that the left is just trying to police his free speech rights. Why is this not free speech? How does this cross the Rubicon of free speech into not protected speech?
Yeah, the Supreme Court has said that we get wide berth in exercising our First Amendment free speech rights. And I think we all embrace that concept, right? We don't want the government telling us what we can say and what we can't say. However, even the Supreme Court said your First Amendment free speech rights yield when the speech you uses is reasonably likely to and intended to incite imminent violence. Brian, there's a reason that every jurisdiction in our country has statutes on the books prohibiting threatening language and threatening conduct. It is because communicating threats to harm another in their person or property does not enjoy First Amendment free speech rights. So don't let anybody say this is just Donald Trump exercising his constitutional right to speak freely.
And by the way, if Kamala Harris or anybody on the left said 1/100th of what Donald Trump just said, we would hear it on an endless loop from Trump himself, from his entire campaign, Fox News. Republicans would petition to add hours to the day so that they can complain about this more. So the notion that this isn't something that we should be talking about or that the other side would just let this go by the wayside if it came out of a Democrat's mouth is completely absurd. So, of course, I think that's why it's important to focus on this right now, and we will, of course, stay on top of it if we have any updates in this arena, especially as it relates to the immediate aftermath of the election and seeing what the judges in those cases opt to do with it. With that said, if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. The links to both of our channels are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.